Oh my God. Oh my God. How? How? And it just changed everything. At the end of this book, I was sobbing, like dead up, ugly crying. Like I even texted my husband and I was like, I'm so glad you're not home right now to see me because I was a freaking mess. Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. March was Women's History Month, and so my goal was just to read exclusively books written by women for the month of March, and I accidentally failed. I was reading a book at the end of February that was written by a dude, and I was almost done with it and didn't want to put off finishing it for a whole month just because of this arbitrary theme that I had set for the month, so I didn't do it. But I read 10 total books and 9 of them are written by women, so I got like a 90% success rate. I also DNF'd one book, so we'll talk about that shortly. But first, let's start with the goals check-in. So my goal to read every book I bought or acquired in 2022. I read 2 books this month that fit that category, Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel and The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson. However, that was the book that I DNF'd. So does that count as meeting the goal? I don't know. And then my goal of reading another book by every new to me author from 2022 whose book I rated 4 stars or higher last year. So for that goal, I had 4 books this month that met that requirement. I read Turning Darkness into Light by Marie Brennan, and last year I read the Memoirs of Lady Trent series by her. I read Cultish by Amanda Montell, and last year I read Word Slut. I read Piranesi by Susanna Clark, and last year I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And I also read Sea of Tranquility, and last year I read Station 11. So let's dive into the wrap up, and I'll just go ahead and start with the book that I DNF'd. The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson. I picked this up at a used bookstore for $3, and the main reason I picked it up was because it's based in Kentucky. It's a Kentucky author. It is based around a really cool historical thing that actually happened, in that before Kentucky had like a full state library system to support all of these rural areas, especially in the Appalachian Mountains, there was this thing called the Pack Horse Librarian Project, where specifically like unmarried women were hired as these pack horse librarians, and they would carry books on horseback to all of these like haulers and underserved communities to provide them with books. So what a cool concept. I was like really excited to read a book about this fictional badass pack horse librarian woman. And the book even has this really cool map of Kentucky. This is an actual map from the 1939 Pack Horse Librarian Project from like the Kentucky Librarian Archives, which is really cool. I DNF'd this book at 38 pages. I actually picked this up really early in the month. This might have been like the first book I picked up after I finished my book that I had carried over from February. And I read about 33 pages of it. And in that time, the protagonist found a man hanging from a tree and then was emotionally abused by her father, and then was physically and sexually assaulted by her husband. And I was just like, this is way more than I want to handle right now. This is not at all as I was expecting. So I put it down and I was like, I'll try again later this month. So I did at the very end of the month pick this book up again, and I read about 6 more pages. And in that time, she was ambushed and like attacked basically by a preacher in the woods that had like been lying in wait for her. So I was just like, I'm done. This is just trauma porn. I don't understand like every possible bad thing that could happen to this woman is happening, and I just don't understand why, and that's not what I wanted out of this. So this is obviously a me problem because I looked on Goodreads and it has a really high rating and a ton of people that I know have read it and really liked it, but yeah, it's just trauma porn. I don't understand. So that was a no for me. On to the books that I actually read this month. I read and completed 10. My book written by a man. This is a nonfiction book. It's called The Saint Who Would Be Santa Claus by Adam C. English. I actually picked this up for research for a different project that I'm working on. And as you can tell, because it's for research, I tabbed the shit out of it. But yeah, I gave this 4 stars. I thought this was pretty informative. It is not really about the legend of Santa Claus. It is about trying to parse who the actual person of Saint Nicholas was. There's so much myth and legend tied into this actual historical person that existed that it is hard to parse. And so that's what this theologian, this biblical scholar, was trying to do. So I did try and take everything that he wrote with a grain of salt, because I'm sure it was tinted with a church bias. But since I was trying to read about a saint, I kind of anticipated that. But I thought he did a really good job of piecing together what he could and explaining the gaps where there were some, and also explaining just like the context of who these historians were who have recorded things about St. Nicholas's life in the past, which was really interesting as well. And the part of the reason that it's so hard to parse anything about this person is because for the most part, there isn't really record of his life in the time that he lived. Most of the people who wrote about him a couple centuries after he died. But yeah, overall, I would say not what I would recommend if you're looking for information about the legend of Santa Claus, but it does go into where a lot of those threads came from. If that is something that interests you, that would be the only reason I would ever recommend this book. I expected it to be dry, and it actually wasn't. I thought it told a pretty good narrative story. Next up, I read Jade City by Fonda Lee. So this is the first book in the Greenbone saga. I read the entire trilogy this month, and I had a lot of thoughts about it. So Jade City is about a fictional island country called Kikon, and it is the only country in the world where this bioenergetic jade naturally occurs. Anyone that wears this jade has like superpowers, basically. They're super strong, they're super fast, they have the ability to send out these like energy waves that can be channeled, and they can also like sense the auras and kind of emotions of the people around them. But it's also really dangerous, and you have to train really hard to be able to use it because it can really mess with your system. The jade in this country is controlled very heavily by these mafias, basically, these like clan families that have gained a lot of power over the centuries in this country. Our story focuses around the Call family, who are the head of the No Peak clan. So when our story starts, the head of the No Peak clan, called the Pillar, is our oldest sibling, Lan, and the head of the military kind of soldier side of the clan is called the Horn, and that is our sibling, Hilo. And then they also have a sister named Shay, and Shay moved away from the country several years ago because she wanted to get out of this kind of mafia lifestyle and make a life for herself. But at the start of the story, she's just moved back to the country, but she still doesn't want to be involved in the family business. And then they also have this adopted younger sibling named Andon, and the start of the story, Andon is at this magical academy, high school type situation where he is training to learn how to use jade. Although there are many different jade clans in this country, No Peak and the Mountain are the two most powerful jade clans, and they have this really intense kind of Cold War rivalry going on. So it's peaceful, but it's like a very tenuous sort of peace when the story starts. I thought this book was excellent, but it was also a little overhyped for me. I didn't get like the 5-star feels when I was reading it, which I fully expected to have just because of how much everyone loves this series. I thought it was really, really good. It was like good in every sort of technical aspect you can imagine. Like the world building was immaculate, the character building, all that kind of stuff, but I didn't feel super connected to them at the start. I do think that Fonda Lee was really smart about her approach to this story, because before this book is over, a significant character that you wouldn't expect has died, and I think that set up the rest of the series really well for the readers to feel extra scared and on edge when any sort of tension or battle or fight scene is happening, because you know that people you care about could actually be in real danger. I would say if you love magic, if you love kung fu movies or mafia stories, definitely give this a try. I think think this was a super duper original story. Next up was Jade War, the second book of the Greenbone saga. As you can guess from the title, the No Peak clan has gone to war with the Mountain clan. At the same time, this book kind of broadens the scope beyond the country of Kikon and into the kind of the wider world, and we're starting to see that foreign countries want access to this magical jade in order to give their own military soldiers these superpowers. And so there is a lot of international tension as well as the tension between the two clans that exists. And that's all I'll say about that because I don't want to ruin any spoilers for the rest of the series. Overall, I felt about the same way about Jade War as I did about Jade City, which was that it was really, really good, but it wasn't quite what I expected as far as my love for it. And then Jade Legacy, on the other hand, oh my God, how? I seriously, after 2 4-stars in a row, I was like, oh, okay, this is just like a 4-star series for me. And then I read Jade Legacy and it just changed everything. And I don't know how Fondly did it. Oh my God. So Jade City and Jade War both take place kind of naturally back to back over the span of a couple years or whatever. Jade Legacy takes a much longer term approach. And so there's quite a few time jumps in here. And I thought that would be a little jarring, but it actually worked really, really well. And it made me feel more connected to the characters overall because I really got to see them grow up or grow old or, all these different changes that happened in their life. And really got to see the legacy of everything that had built up in the first 2 books. And so really you'd have a couple of chapters and then it was every few chapters it would skip ahead 3 years or something like that. And it just kind of built that way throughout the book. You really get to see the long-term impact of some of the decisions that were made all the way back in book 1. There was some real emotional turmoil in this book as well. I just felt so deeply for the characters at this point. I'd gotten to know them so well, and especially when they made decisions that were clearly the wrong decisions or just treated the people that they loved poorly. And you were like, no, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that to each other? Why are you doing that to yourselves? It was just, At the end of this book, I was sobbing, dead up, ugly crying. I even texted my husband and I was like, I'm so glad you're not home right now to see me because I was a freaking mess. Fondly, she had it out for me with that one. I have not felt that way at the end of a book in a really, really long time. So I just have nothing but positive things to say about this book. It was incredible. I do think that now, having finished the whole series and feeling the way about Jade Legacy that I did, that I went back and reread the series in the future, I would probably like the first 2 books even more just because I feel so much more deeply connected to these characters after all of that time with them and knowing how it all plays out in the end. So I would say I recommended this series, but after Jade Legacy, I highly recommend the series. And if you're only feeling good about the first 2, just wait, buckle up, baby. It gets better. After I cried my eyes out, finishing up the Greenbone saga, my next book was The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. And I gave this 5 stars. I read it in a day. It's pretty short. I really, really liked this. I don't think I liked it quite as much as I liked Station 11, but it was still 5 stars. I feel like Emily St. John Mandel writes about pandemics in a way that just hits so hard, especially because she wrote this one. Actually, Station 11 was written before COVID. And this one was written after COVID. And I just felt like, it was so impactful. So this story follows 3 different kind of main characters. There's this young man named Edwin in the early 1900s, and he moves to Canada after being exiled from the UK by his family, who are ashamed of him, and they're like, go grow up and maybe you can come back later. And then there is a woman named Olive, centuries in the future, I guess, that lives on a lunar colony, and she is back on Earth to do a book tour. She is an author, and I definitely felt like Olive was kind of a self-insert character for Emily St. John Mandel. And, you know, maybe not, but just all of her little anecdotes about being on book tour and how people think it's so glamorous, but it's really just like exhausting. And people say like stupid shit to you all the time that really gets under your skin and makes you feel like not a person. So that was really interesting. And I really, really enjoyed all the aspects of the book from Olive's perspective. And then Gasperi is our other main character. And he is a man also living on a lunar colony several hundred years after Olive's time. And he works for a time agency. And when he is reading Olive's book in the future, he reads this description of an event or kind of like anomaly that happens to one of the characters in her book. And it matches up with this anomaly that Edwin experienced when he was in Canada back in the early 1900s. And so he thinks, as this time agent, that this is possibly like a rift in the space-time continuum, and so he goes back to investigate and meets up with both of these characters. I thought that the mystery was really intriguing, and the characters were interesting, and the plot, yeah, it followed one after another, and I was done before I knew it. Really, really liked it. Then I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So basically, Piranesi is this guy that lives in this giant labyrinth house that has like these huge halls and statues everywhere, and there's like oceans inside of it. It's crazy. This book is so weird. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Everyone told me to go into this book blind because like the mystery of like exploring the house is part of the fun. The house is infinite. There's nothing outside of it, but there is one other person in the house that Piranesi calls the other. So if that sounds intriguing to you, definitely pick this up. It was so out there in the best way. I feel like Susanna Clarke is a master storyteller, regardless of whether her books are like less than 300 pages or over 800 pages. She just definitely has a way with stories. So then I read Turning Darkness into Light by Marie Brennan. On Goodreads, this is called The Memoirs of Lady Trent number 6, but the Memoirs of Lady Trent series is actually only 5 books. And this is set in the same world, but it is more of a companion novel to that series than it is actually a part of that series, because it is not one of Lady Trent's memoirs. The main character in Turning Darkness into Light is Lady Trent's granddaughter, whose name is Audrey. And Audrey didn't work quite as well for me as Isabella, Lady Trent, did in the original series. And it's probably just because she is like a translator and not a scientist. And my background is in science, which is one of the things that made me really connect to Isabella as a character. But she is basically a linguist of this ancient Draconian language. And when these ancient Draconian tablets are uncovered, she is hired by this really pompous lord named Lord Glinley to come live at her house and translate these tablets. In the process of doing this translation and living in Lord Glinley's house, Audrey starts to uncover what she believes is a deep political conspiracy that could change the fate of the nation. And that's kind of what it's about. So overall, I thought this book was worthy to be included along with the Lady Trent series. I think if you liked the Lady Trent series, you will like Turning Darkness into Light. Like I said, the protagonist didn't work quite as well for me, but I will say that Marie Brennan definitely has a thing for writing tenacious, academically minded Victorian era ladies, and I would read more of them if there were more. Then I read another nonfiction book called Story Genius by Lisa Cron. The subtitle is How to Use Brain Science to Go Beyond Outlining and Write a Riveting Novel. So as you know, if you watched my previous video, 2 videos ago, recently last month, I published a video about the fact that I am going to attempt to write a fantasy novel later this year. And so I bought several books on craft. This one was one of them. Save the Cat Writes a Novel was another. This is a really interesting look at how to structure stories. And her thing is that it's all about designing your plot around your character arc rather than trying to fit your character arc into your existing plot. And that was a really interesting approach that really forced me to think about my story in a different kind of way. And so I really appreciated her take on that and thought it was really helpful for myself. But also she was super prescriptive and kind of pretentious about it. Definitely phrased things in a way that made it seem like her way to write stories was the one and only true way to write stories. And that was very off-putting. I did tab it up. Obviously, I'm going to be referencing this and keeping it as a reference probably for many years to come. But at one point, she was even like telling me the correct way to organize my notes and folders as I was writing my story. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I was about ready to throw this book across the room at that point, because I was just like, anyone who is an author or a writer will tell you that everyone has a different way to approach things, and there's no really wrong way to do it. We all end up with good stories in the end. So anyway, yeah, I would recommend this book, but with the caveat to just take what's useful out of it and ignore basically all of her rhetoric about writing. Yeah, good book that did what I needed. The 9th book that I read this month was Cultish by Amanda Montell. I picked this up not because I'm super interested in cults, but because I'm super interested in the language. And Amanda Montell's whole shtick is that she looks at language. Word Slut, the book that I read last year, was about the language of the patriarchy, basically. So this was about the language that cults use to enrapture certain people of the population into their clutches. It was a great read. It definitely taught me a lot about a topic I know very little about. And it was really interesting because she structured it. The first part was kind of just like about what is a cult? How do we define a cult? You know, what is brainwashing? All this kind of stuff. And then the next like 5 parts of the book were kind of like a sliding scale of like, this part was about suicide cults. And then there was like Scientology. And then it went all the way down to CrossFit and Soul Cycle type of things, you know? So it was this whole thing about like, not only what we think of when we think of cults, but also like all the things that we call cults when we're like, oh, those Soul Cycle people are so culty or whatever. So I thought that was really interesting way to look at it, and how she defines what a cult is and isn't. And she bases it all around this academic research and stuff as well, which is great. It was written in a very accessible way, and it also included snippets from a lot of interviews that she did with former cult members or cult survivors in some instances. And I thought that she wrote the book in a very understanding and compassionate sort of way, which was really nice. And then the very last book that I read, book number 10, was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I want to thank my friend Mel for letting me borrow this book. I didn't know that it was going to be made into a show. And so the fact that the show also came out this month when I was basically reading this book was really serendipitous. I haven't started watching the show yet, but I'm sure I will. This was great. I don't know what sort of crack Taylor Jenkins Reid is filling her books with, but I want more of it. This was really, really fun to read. And once again, it was just compulsively readable. I didn't want to put it down. It's a historical fiction about a band called Daisy Jones and the Six. And I'm pretty sure the author said that it was kind of based around her love for Stevie Nicks, which was cool. It's told as sort of like a documentary style oral history in which this journalist is like interviewing all the members of the band like 10 years after the band broke up or whatever, and just talking to them about their experiences. So even though the interviews take place separately, all of their experiences are together on the page. And so they're talking about the same events at the same time. And one of the things that I thought was really masterful about this book was that everyone remembers the same events differently. And that was really, really cool kind of exploration of memory and like the stories we tell ourselves about the things that happened to us. But it goes through how the Six formed as a band, how Daisy Jones joined up with the Six, and just kind of like all of their experiences, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you know, what made them split up in the end, and their killer album and their tour and all that kind of stuff. Camilla was by far my favorite character. Camilla was Billy's wife. Billy was the main lead singer of the Six, and she was just wise beyond her years and was the perfect foil to all the members of the band. Karen, the keyboardist, I also thought was a super interesting character that I loved reading from. And Warren, the drummer, had these hilarious one-liners that made me laugh several times throughout the book. I just thought that all the characters were really cool and complex and just felt like real people. Yeah, it was fun hearing all their different sides of it. I will definitely be reading more Taylor Jenkins Reid in the future. This was an easy 5 stars for me. So that is all the books that I read in the month of March. Thank you guys for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. As always, be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. See you next time.